In the 50-plus years since the Patterson film came out, there has not been a conclusive decision if the film is real or just another hoax. Attempts have been made by both skeptics and Bigfoot believers to determine the film's true purpose. In a step-by-step analysis, this video will go over the points I think are important. First, we'll start with the history before the film was taken. The year was 1957. At this point in history, the concept of giant hairy people wasn't new to human history. Native Americans from the forest usually, if not always, had stories of giant keepers of the woods in their folklore. In fact, the first contemporary sighting of a wild man of the woods was in 1818 of the September edition of the Watchman newspaper of New York State. But I digress. In 1957, there was a project to make a road going through Bluff Creek, California. The purpose of the road was to help the logging industry of the time. Then, in March of 1958, workmen claimed to have found strange tracks, but oddly enough, not many could remember quite what they looked like. Some claimed they were bear tracks, and others said it was the work of some prankster. As quickly as it came, the workers dismissed it and went on with their work. Then, on August 3rd of 1958, the workers arrived at the scene of their work to find that their equipment had been disturbed, including a 700-pound tire that had been thrown around. 24 days later, the workers found their work site disturbed again by something that came in the night, but it left tracks this time. Jerry Crew was one to find the footprints around the bulldozer he had been using. At first, Jerry thought it was a prank, but after studying the tracks, he became convinced that the prints were made by some kind of huge man. Then, crew members including Jerry had more odd experiences leading into the fall of the year. The biggest piece of evidence against these occurrences was Ray Wallace, the overall boss of the construction crew that was hired to work on the Bluff Creek Road. It later became revealed that Ray Wallace had his own pair of wooden enlarged feet, making him a hoaxer or a prankster. The oddest part about this is when some of the strange activity was happening, Ray Wallace wasn't even in the state of California. Skeptics might say that there were two hoaxers behind this, Ray Wallace and a second party that had started the hoax while Ray was out of state. Though perhaps Ray Wallace thought the first tracks were fake, and that inspired him to make his own. Regardless, these occurrences were the spark that put the Patterson Gimlin film into motion. Now, let's take a look at the man behind the camera, Roger Patterson. This snippet comes from the Southeast Sasquatch Association blogspot website biography on Roger Patterson. Roger Clarence Patterson was born in Walls, South Dakota on February 14, 1933. He and his family eventually moved to Yakima, Washington. Patterson became a rodeo rider and rancher in the Yakima area right around the Tampico Valley. Patterson began his interest in the subject of Bigfoot in late 1959 after reading an article by Ivan T. Sanderson in True Magazine, which described the sightings and footprints of a large, hairy, unknown creature in Northern California in the Bluff Creek area after a road construction crew found large tracks around their construction site. At the time, slightly before the Patterson film, Roger Patterson became an amateur Sasquatch investigator, interviewing people for their witness accounts and collected supposed Sasquatch prints. He even wrote a book on the subject called Do Abominable Snowmen of America Really Exist? At the time, the Abominable Snowman was more well known, so most supposed giant hairy men were referred to as abominable snowmen. At the time, Roger's book did not sell very well, but after the Patterson film, his book sales were booming. Some detractors will say that Patterson faked the whole thing just so that he could sell a couple thousand books. Regardless, Roger Patterson was able to convince his skeptical friend and fellow rancher, Bob Gimlin, to go on an adventure to the Bluff Creek area after Roger's wife had received information that a man had found fresh prints in the area. The duo spent about 3 weeks in the area before finally finding a female Sasquatch and filming her. This is the beginning of a controversy that would cause a long history of debate. Now that we have the history out of the way, I want to talk about the skeptical aspect of the Patterson film. While some might not believe so, it's actually very healthy to practice skepticism. It helps you to understand the world around you and not make a fool of yourself, or as much a fool of yourself. But like anything, too much skepticism can be a bad thing too, that leads you to not being open to new ideas. It is a fact that science is constantly being rewritten. This is apparent in the fact that we have to update textbooks every so often because our knowledge of the world changes. And the sad fact of the matter is, some people use skepticism to make themselves feel superior and make people feel inferior. In a perfect world, skeptics would calmly reason with those with large claims instead of insulting their intelligence and dismissing them right away. A lot of skeptics write off the Patterson film with a statement that holds no ground in logic. Skeptics will say the Patterson film is a hoax because it looks like a man in a gorilla suit. This is not evidence. This is a subjective statement. Just because a person says it looks like someone in a gorilla suit, that doesn't automatically disprove it. The same thing happens with colors. One person will say that it looks like pink, another will say it's purple. So does that mean it's not purple because to one person it looks like pink? No, it simply means that the person's opinion states it's purple, while the other person's opinion states it's pink. And to incorporate this into my reasoning, just because your opinion states that it looks like a man in a gorilla suit does not make it a man in a gorilla suit. So then, why do people think it's a man in a gorilla suit? The biggest reason could be that people simply aren't willing to accept the idea of Sasquatch, so they explain it away with the most similar thing they can think of, like a man in a suit. But maybe it looks like a man in a gorilla suit because it's an upright hominid that's similar enough to humans, though a little different. Sasquatch appears to combine non-human ape-like features and human features, so of course it would look like a man in a hairy suit, because that's the closest thing that we can compare it to. But the comparison might just be a comparison. On Skeptic.com, Daniel Loxton writes a review on Greg Long's book, The Making of Bigfoot, a book dedicated to debunking the Patterson film. And while talking about the Patterson film, he says it certainly looks like a guy in a gorilla suit. But the film quality is too poor to reach any definitive conclusion. Regardless, Loxton goes on to say things like, most skeptics are more than a little sick of the Patterson film. In our hearts, skeptics know three things about the film: that it easily could have been faked, that it almost certainly was, and that it's very unlikely, despite the periodic rumors, to ever be proven a fake. Let's pick at this bit by bit. That it easily could have been faked. People have tried to recreate the supposed Patty suit, and few, if not all, have failed. The BBC tried to remake it, and it was a failure. Philip Morris and Bob Hieronymus tried to recreate it, and they failed too. So why do they say it's so easy to fake when we've been shown that it isn't quite that easy? Then you get the addition to the above statement that it almost certainly was fake, referring to the fact that skeptics have this magical gut feeling that tells them that it isn't real. And without any proof to back it up, it's just as silly as the claims they are so against. Loxton then goes on to say, it certainly looks like a guy in a gorilla suit, but the film quality is too poor to reach any definitive conclusions. So Loxton says that the film was almost certainly fake, but then contradicts himself by saying that the film quality is too low to make a conclusion. So then why is he making a conclusion saying that it's almost certainly fake? The article then turns to Greg Long, the skeptic who studied Roger Patterson as a person. The article states, to find answers, Long spent several years traveling the Northwest, tracking down old witnesses, and taping interviews with anyone who was even vaguely connected to Patterson or the film. Each of these contacts often recommended additional sources, whom Long patiently tracked down and interviewed. So Greg Long is using anecdotal evidence from people vaguely connected to Patterson to prove his claims. That's odd, because when people use anecdotal evidence to prove Sasquatch is real, skeptics jump on them and say that anecdotal evidence isn't real. So let's use their reasoning against them. These people Greg Long was interviewing could have easily been lying or remembering their accounts wrong. I've tried to find real evidence that would point to Roger Patterson being a con man, and so far it's just anecdotal. The only real piece of evidence is that Patterson was in trouble with the law because he didn't pay for the camera and film he used to make the Patterson film. And that's another thing that gets me. Patterson is a supposed con man, but he's very poor. How could he pay for the suit of that quality? Some say that he made the suit out of horsehide, some say Philip Morris made the suit while Patterson made the mask, but believe it or not, these are all just claims. How could this unemployed rodeo rider orchestrate this by himself when he couldn't even pay for a camera and the film? To this very date, the claimed suit used in the film has never been found. Greg Long and his wealth of witness testimonies paint Roger Patterson as a short-tempered scam artist that would con anyone, including his own mother. Sadly, Roger Patterson can't be interviewed about this to clear his name, so people have no problem besmirching a dead man when there's no consequence to what they say. But even if Roger Patterson was alive and tried to clear his name, would they even believe him? Because these skeptics have firmly placed the idea that the film is fake, they won't even listen to anything that supports the films, but will readily hold on to any piece of negative information regardless of how small or how accurate it is. Daniel Loxton's article does nothing but praise Greg Long, while they both kick a defenseless dead man. All Loxton does is perpetuate a flawed kind of thinking while promoting a book from a man with dubious intentions. Now let's talk about the other half of the Patterson film, the rancher named Bob Gimlin. An article from Outside Online tells the story of a man whose life has been changed because of the film. The article says, "Looking back on the trip today, Gimlin wishes he said no, that he turned away from Patterson that day at the service station and never looked back. That trip to California changed him. It ruined me," Gimlin was quoted to say. Following Patterson's death in 1972, Bob Gimlin was forced to deal with the negative reaction of skeptics by himself. Gimlin alone faced the scourge of detractors that were emerging around the country. Some even confronted he and his wife in their hometown. Yakima was the place where Gimlin had become known for his fearlessness and strength, and suddenly he was seen as crazy. His word, his handshake, currency around this part of the state, was in doubt. Gimlin goes on to say, "My wife was a teller at a savings and loan institution. Of course, she was sitting right there, and the public would come in and make smart remarks," Gimlin says. This went on and on and on until she'd come home crying. She'd say, "I'm not tough enough." A couple times, we were going to split up over this. Some nights, cars would screech by Gimlin's house. They'd come driving in my driveway all times of night and go, "Bob, we want to go Bigfoot hunting," he says. They'd speed away before he could run outside. The article goes on to say, the couple felt isolated, and Gimlin found himself for the first time in the predicament that came to define his life for decades. If he acknowledged that he saw Bigfoot, he was the town loon. If he stayed quiet, people assumed he was lying. Greg Long even states, "I consider Bob Gimlin a liar. I think he's a con artist." My question is, has Greg Long ever met Bob Gimlin face to face? Was this the true face of the skeptic community? Terrorizing Gimlin was one thing, but to go to his wife's place of work and insult her? Maybe the skeptics are right, but their behavior was in fact quite malicious. Do skeptics think that just because someone believes in something that they don't, it gives them the right to terrorize people? Time and time again, skeptics insult believers, call them idiots, liars, or crazy. How is this any way to convince someone? This just adds contempt and gets nothing done one way or the other. Bob Gimlin was just a rancher and a horse breeder. He was just an ordinary man who agreed to accompany Roger Patterson to Bluff Creek. But what's the supporting evidence for the Patterson film? From the book Sasquatch: True Life Encounters with the Legendary Ape Man, a man by the name of Bob Titmus investigated the Bluff Creek scene. Bob Titmus was a third party that was not associated with Patterson or Gimlin. The book goes on to say, the Bob Titmus visit showed that whatever made the Sasquatch tracks had walked over 600 yards through the forest and then downhill to the creek, crossed the creek, and walked along the creek, and then walked along the canyon before turning back into the forest and moving uphill for at least 300 yards. Why would a hoaxer make tracks for about 900 yards, roughly half a mile, when they'd only need a few to prove their point? But skeptics will always try and find a reason for anything, often making huge leaps in logic just to explain something away, and sometimes offering explanations that are just as silly as they claim Bigfoot to be. To wrap things up, nobody knows for sure if the film is real or not, but that doesn't stop skeptics trying to belittle others, perhaps out of frustration. One truth is for sure, the Patterson film was a very influential piece of media that can't be debunked to this day.